So let's go ahead and call this Rules Committee meeting to order. Go ahead and start with introductions, starting with Pete.
John Weddleton.
Oh, sure.
Pete Peterson.
Forrest Dunbar.
Meg Zalatel.
Christopher Constant.
Suzanne LaFrance.
Felix Rivera.
Austin Davidson.
Before we delve into the topics for the Rules Committee meeting, I just want to mention the news the governor made just an hour ago on his vetoes. I won't go into the specifics now, but I would suggest every member review these vetoes, get familiar with them. Some of them are going to have a very direct impact on our budget and on Anchorage taxpayers. So I think we have a lot of work to do convincing our legislators to veto and use that authority they have.
Override the veto.
Yeah, override the veto. Yeah, thank you. So delving into the topics we have today, we have 4 topics. So first is follow up on our goal setting work. 2 is share how the meeting with the legislature went on homelessness. 3 is go around table and share any ideas or ordinances folks have in the hopper. And then 4, any update from committees. So I'll start very briefly with the first one. So Lori should be sending us her draft sometime soon. I don't know if she's been sending it out to the different groups or not to get clarity. Okay, so she should do that soon. I plan on meeting with the co-chairs of the committees that match the buckets as needed to review, get further thoughts on the goals and the budget priorities, and further finalize the work that Lori puts out. Like she said, it's probably going to be in very draft form. So after review with the co-chairs, any remaining work will be completed by Assembly leadership, so Ms. LaFrance and I, and Assembly department heads. And the plan is to bring that back as a sort of a quote-unquote final product back to the entire body via a work session by mid to late July. And the important piece I want to point out there is the need to get those budget priorities. That needs to be done sooner rather than later. So anything that you guys have on those budget priorities as it matches those buckets, please share those with me when I meet with you. I would like feedback on one item because we weren't really able to tackle it in those meetings, the communication and civic engagement internal goal. So I would like feedback on how we move forward with that goal. Does it need to be as formal as some of the other goals, or is the current way that the work is getting done good enough? And I just want to note that clerk staff working on these ideas right now, which we have Anna that's working on them, and then Barbara and Desiree working on them. As Meg knows, they're maxed out right now on sort of the amount of new ideas when it comes to the communication and civic piece right now, and they're not taking anything new until January. And that's just a matter of staffing, right? Our staff are maxed out right now. So with that, how do you guys want to proceed with that communication and civic engagement piece? Any thoughts on that?
Well,
Yeah.
there's one piece that's just missing, and that is the publication of the materials, the ordinances we pass, having access to the public for all this work that we're doing to see what we're making law. It's weird for people to have to figure out to go to muni codes and then see items that have not yet been adopted or entered into. And so we really need to come up with a way to return to having our ordinances and resolutions that pass accessible to the public. And I don't think we can wait until January.
So you're suggesting, just to be clear, that we have like a link that says ordinances passed, and we put all the
Once they
links,
get
all of them?
signed, scanned up there, and made available to the public so that the public can know what we're doing. Because they only get it through ADN, and even then, they're only getting a filtered version instead of being able to read it themselves.
Barbara wants to.
Yeah, Ms. Jones.
Through the chair, there are a couple of barriers, but there are always solutions. And so, Mr. Chair, one of the things that we can do on the Assembly homepage under items of interest, we can post anything you want there, and we can post it immediately after ordinances are approved and passed. I would suggest that I don't think you want all of them there, but we could put all of them there.
Well, so if I might, the problem is if we don't have a place to go where you can search into some form of a database and have AO-2019-04, you don't know what you need until you need it. And it's awkward for me, and I'm okay doing it because I've been conditioned to have to ask a staff member, can you find me this item? But it seems to me that a better arrangement would to figure out a way to just publish the items that we're passing to a website that's not items of interest, but is just a repository that's for the public for all the items that we do. And if we don't have that, we should find a way to automate that, even if it takes a little bit longer. And I know we have had that, and I recognize there are challenges with certain things that the body has decided not to make completely available on the website, but we have to do something.
Ms. Quinn Davidson on that point?
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's a great idea, and I think what the public wants from us is two things: to do good work and then to know about it. And right now we're doing good work, but I agree that people don't have an opportunity to see what the result is, so they can review what we're about to work on, and then it disappears into an abyss. So I actually think it's one of the most important things that the clerk's website or the assembly website should have.
Through the chair, I think that it's a great idea. We can do two things. We can go back to the way we used to do it and leave all the items on the agenda so that people can access them that way, although they will not be current, right? Because if you did an amendment on the bears and trash, the document that would be pulled up from the agenda would not have the amendments. It wouldn't be the final version. So that we could keep doing, and that's the way most people search for documents for the last probably about 7 years or 8 years. The other process, I need to talk to the chair and the vice chair about this. It is a staffing and a programming issue, and right now it seems fairly simple. If it was, we would have done it, and I'm just afraid to tell you it's not. So we need to talk, we need to take a look at the process, and then we can make some decisions. As the chair knows, we have some options for some temporary staff, and if that's what you want to do, we'll go ahead and do that.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Mr. Wells.
I used to like the old way, now I don't like the old way. And I think because it would be misleading, look at some recent things like that cell phone ordinance, the amendments changed it dramatically from, school days to all the time. That's a huge difference. And even the recent trash ones, we had some changes. So it would be really misleading to leave it, like we used to. But there is a real need to have the current stuff on there, because I know so this trash one, I'm getting lots of emails. Well, what's this mean? And I want to attach the ordinance to it so they can read it, and I'll tell them the narrative too. But I don't have that, typically at my fingertips. So yeah, it would be nice to find some way. And maybe not the liquor licenses, the marijuana stuff, but the big stuff that we're doing, ordinance code changes.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, if you give us a discrete list, we can probably manage it. I can't do them all.
Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Johnston.
The idea of a temporary staff or paying a contractor or coming up with the methodology to get us to a baseline and come up with the procedures wise. And again, we need to close the loop with the public of the work that we're doing, and it shouldn't have to be the public has to call the clerk and ask for an email, or I have to call an email. We have to come up with a way. This is 2020 just about, and we have to figure this out.
Thank you, Mr. Johnston. Mr. Wells.
Just post anything that's going to be in the newspaper on top radio the next day.
It's not enough. You don't know what you need until you need it.
Just don't listen to Tom Radio.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. All right, so I will go ahead and explore these with my vice chair and assembly leadership. So, other than that one thing, right? Which I think would be a huge communication piece of getting our work out to the public. Any other thoughts or ideas on the overall plank of the communication and civic engagement internal goal? Yeah, Ms. Sultan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One thing I asked about early when I came on the body, and I still think would be valuable, is whether or not we can get authorization to have our own website or web page that you can link to from the assembly, so we can have our own clearinghouse for information for our constituents to some extent. The newsletters are kind of clunky because you have to get email addresses from people, and most of us know how to or can find a way to get a website built because we ran campaigns. And I'm just trying to figure out kind of the one-stop shopping place where I can at least highlight certain things. It might relieve some of the pressure from the clerk's office as well, based on what I know my constituents want, and also be a communication portal for them to get into me, and direct things into my email or whatever. So I'd like to put that on the radar again. I did let it drop, but I think it's really kind of an essential piece.
We can look at that. Mr. Weddleton.
Just, if I guess ask maybe on that. So do you mean like your own personal thing? I mean, in the history of the assembly, people have done that. Patrick Flynn used to have a great one. Testy used to have a usually fun blog or whatever you call them, So people have just set up their own and done it.
Okay, that's fantastic. I guess I just wanted to be able to, where we have our bios and our info, like have it so you can click that and go. Even if there's an warning saying you're leaving an official municipal website and you're going to this place. Because right now I'm struggling. And a lot of us have Facebook pages with very few controls on them. I really abhor using Facebook for this interaction. I don't find it to be useful or as comprehensive as I do.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Thank you, Ms. Sultan. Yeah, Mr. Johnson.
So just as another plank of this communications process, I have said this a number of times that I believe we're not using our committees to their capacity. And there are two deliverables that I would hope we establish as a minimum criteria for our committees that are kind of the bigger ones: homelessness, public safety, health policy, et cetera. And that is that each committee working with its membership will establish two things: a budget proposal, priority kind of framework. These are the things that we want to see that can be brought to the body, and also a legislative priority that each committee can suss and work on and detail up and say, these are the legislative priorities that we would like to see working with the state. And then those items would be brought back to the body so that when we enter into the budget process and into the legislative review process, we have a detailed and thoroughly vetted platform of proposals that the body can move forward. And we don't just depend on the last minute, well, what's our legislative proposal? And then we just kind of pick what's hot today. And so I would like us to establish that kind of deeply into the procedures of our committee.
Thank you, Mr. Clausen. Okay, so seeing no further discussion on that, we're going to go ahead and move on with second item. I'm going to turn it over to Meg to talk about the meeting with the legislature on homelessness.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We met with the chair, Mr. Constant, and myself in a roundtable discussion with the legislative delegation from Anchorage, some of them. It was well attended, and I would say it was very much informational from the administration, giving information about how things practically and actually work with regard to homelessness, both in terms of how we notice, abate, and clean camps, how we work on sheltering individuals, and how the administration interprets our legal obligations with respect to notice and abatement and cleanup and what's a personal item and kind of some of the history of that. I found that in kind of debriefing with a few of the state delegation members later that it was informative for them. We kind of are living it day to day, and we've kind of become intimately acquainted with it in a way that I don't think they were very familiar with. It seemed the concerns were, it's very visible. They're getting concerns and calls about the visibility of homelessness in their communities. And so there was some of that discussion. And there was, I think, a couple of requests, and I think Ms. Browse might be here, to do follow-up meetings maybe around particular topics or areas. So I don't know if there are any questions about what happened in the meeting. Yeah.
Actually, Mr. Johnson, do you want to add anything onto that description?
It was a thoughtful meeting.
Yes. And then the only thing I'll add before I turn it over to you, Ms. Quinn Davidson, is I did, sort of pursuant to what I mentioned last time, did invite the legislature, sort of open-ended, once you guys are done with your work, whenever that happens, if you want to meet with the assembly, we can make that happen. So that invitation was extended to them. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple things. Did you all announce that the reason that other members weren't there was because of the Open Meetings Act? Because I felt pretty awkward that it might look like a lot of us weren't interested. And there was a lot of news coverage and people sharing things, and it highlighted members who were there, and I felt a little bit awkward about that.
Yes, the chair made a brief set of statements at the beginning saying that we were restricted by the Open Meetings Act.
Okay. Thank you for doing that.
And and an invitation for a larger meeting between the assembly and the delegation, kind of as an open meeting in the future, if that's what we want to do.
Great, thanks. And then second, Matt Clayman and I, he wrote me and told me what happened in the meeting, and we were checking in, and he said, "Oh, I don't have a copy of the physical slides, but I have a copy of the paper. I'd be happy to make you a copy, scan it to you if you don't have it." And it made me realize there were slides, and none of us have seen them. So if we could get those, I think that would make us feel more in the loop of what happened. Bonus given a thumbs up. And then the other piece was, I was wondering if you had, I've been thinking a lot about, as we get up to the budget season, how I think the communications around what we're doing on homelessness needs a lot of work, and that a lot of time, we're hearing all these op-eds, and there's a lot going on, and I don't think the Muni as a whole is doing a good job of responding to all of that and to sharing with the public what's actually going on. I think that sort of led to what the legislature did. I don't agree with it, but I think in part it's a failure in communications. And so I've been really thinking about how we as the assembly can take a leadership role in that, and I'm just wondering if that was part of the discussion and what you all think about that who were there.
It wasn't a part of the discussion at that particular meeting, but there has been a discussion with the co-chairs of the Committee on Homelessness, the administration, and the coalition about having a better and coordinated strategy with regard to communication, because there is diffuse information going out and coming in, so that we can either be on the same page or highlight where our differences do exist and whose difference it is. And that is at its initial stage, I will say. We've talked about it once with some follow-up schedule.
Okay, that sounds great. And yeah, just to throw in there, I feel like there's all this stuff happening out there, and it looks like we're not responding to it. And if the administration chooses not to respond, and they don't want to write op-eds, and they don't want to be talking about it openly, I think we need to, or we're going to be dragged down with the rest. So just peace.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Mr. Peterson and Mr. Hunts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you were talking about slides. What did they have a video presentation or
They
something?
had a PowerPoint, yeah.
Oh.
We did.
We did?
Oh, I
or-
did. Well,
Oh.
yeah.
So I wasn't invited, so I didn't see those.
Through the chair to Mr. Peterson, the invitation was issued to the chair to invite the assembly members to the meeting that would keep within the bounds of the Open Meetings Act. Since the legislature has exempted themselves from the Open Meetings Act, they can be in the room with as many of them as they like.
I'm well aware of that.
We will forward these slides to you. It was a compilation of information from the fire department, the police department, the municipal attorney, and our housing and homelessness coordinator. And it's all information that the assembly is aware of, but I'm happy to forward that content and all of the supporting content that we provided to the legislators, which included the Anchored Home Plan, the Pay for Success program opportunities, and a couple of other things, including the Martin v. Boise case and the Engle versus the Municipality of Anchorage case, so that they can understand the legal parameters that we operate in.
So if I might follow up on that, did it seem like they were surprised by some of this information? They were uninformed? And
Through the chair to Mr. Peterson, I think the answer is yes.
well, good. Thank you.
I don't know. I would respond slightly differently, that everyone pretended like it was all good. And the meeting never really got to the point where we could have a discussion about those things, because the administration's presentation was absolutely comprehensive and excellent. But the time was limited, and even the primary author of the letter left halfway through the meeting. And so I think that there was an important depth provision of information. We provided them with a bunch of information, and there was some conversation, light back and forth, but we never did, in my opinion, dive into the meaningful differences or challenges as resulting from the letter, you know, to the point that I've been hearing from people still telling me to do horrible things to homeless people as a direct fruit of their voice. And so I would just offer that, in my opinion, it was an excellent presentation to them and a little bit of flat soda of a conversation afterwards, because we needed more time. And so, yeah. And to your point of communication, so I put myself in the queue, I've been saying to the team up on the 8th floor that we do need to work on a communication strategy. The problem is, and I think we could all recognize this, is that for us to fund a communication strategy, looks like we're hiring a marketing team to tell a story about us, right? And that could seem a bit unusual, and you get hammered for that. And so the Rasmussen Foundation is apparently funding a $30,000 communications strategy, but it won't be ours. And so I think that your point is very well made, and we ought to contemplate our own vehicles of response. And I obviously shouldn't be in charge of that, because I would tell them what I really think. We need it filtered, but but I agree with you, and I think we should really deeply contemplate how we do that, and more broadly than homelessness, because we're doing so much.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Ms. Salatel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One thing that did come out of the meeting was a discussion about state right-of-ways and how that's a complicating factor for the municipality where we are seeing effects of homelessness. And I know that we had Senator Gray Jackson and Representative Drummond excused themselves early from the Midtown Community Council meeting to go to a joint meeting with the DOT and the municipality on that issue. So there was a little bit of forward movement there. They were unaware that maybe state right-of-ways were something that we couldn't deal with, or the municipality really couldn't deal with, and that we did learn that there was no line item funding for such a thing in the DOT's budget. So.
On that specific?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So when you're talking about the DOT right-of-ways, you're talking about the Muni's lack of authorization to like clear or abate in that area, or can you say more about that?
Actually, Oda might be in a better position to say more about it, but it was the idea that we don't, always have authorization, and we have to coordinate with the state.
Through the chair, we are having this conversation internally about how much time our cleanup crews spend working within DOT right-of-ways after achieving authorization from DOT to go and do that work. Some of the DOT right-of-ways have been cleaned up by DOT. Quite a few of them have been cleaned up by our Muni teams. So we're running an assessment on how much square footage, how much tonnage, how much time is taken in each of those locations to figure out how much funding we spend cleaning up their areas. We're having a constructive conversation with DOT right now about that. We want to give them the data so that they're fully aware of what we see happening and whether or not there is opportunity to collaborate on that in the future.
Thanks. Got it.
Thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Whittleton.
Thanks. I had a couple of things to flesh out. So you said it was well attended. Is that the public was there, or how many legislators?
It was not a public meeting. It was I don't have the head count, but I bet Ona does.
Through the chair to Mr. Whittleton, there were 7 legislators and I believe staffers from another 6 or 7 offices. I'd be happy to send along the agenda and attendance list with the other information that comes to you, slide deck, etc., so that you're aware of that. I think of the, I believe, 24 Anchorage Caucus members, that is not a fantastic turnout, but it is about what we expected to respond to the invitation, considering the original letter was only signed by, I believe, 8 legislators, and not all 8 of those legislators attended. But we did have, people represented from their offices as far as staff.
Yeah.
So, I guess I understand here, so there was no talk about them doing their job and the budget and so on, never got to that.
Never got there.
And there's no apology
time for that.
coming or anything.
In fact, if I
That's what I
might
was
just
gonna
briefly, Zach asserted 2 times in his statements that he clearly believes he was right. He didn't say that he believes he was right, but the way he said what he said about his messaging was clear that he did no wrong.
Clearly, I'm sure we're unanimous on this. That it was tragically, they should backpedal from that like crazy. But then to see the Midtown Community Council use that letter
Yeah.
as, factual support
Basis.
for their odd letter, that shows the danger of doing that.
And both getting huge coverage.
Yeah.
And the danger of us not having responded in a way that's strategic and really clear on the messaging, waiting. And so there is some argument to say just let it go over, but I am still getting calls from people telling me to drop them in the park. But not the park in our neighborhood, though, the park where the bears are. It's funny, but it's terrifying because they mean it. And they feel justified in their meaning of it because legislators have said this is what we can do. It's like scary.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
I was actually going to ask the same thing Mr. Weddleton did. Did they talk about the letter and did they apologize at all for the tact they had taken? But it sounds like the answer is no.
Through the chair to Ms. Quinn Davidson and Mr. Weddleton. No, they did not apologize, and to be perfectly frank, in conversations that we have had with some of the signatories of the letter, they maintain that their public apologies are more than enough to cover their feelings of guilt associated with signing that letter. We disagree. Our intent with the meeting was not to point fingers or to continue a public fight about this where there are actual people involved, and to educate them so that they are fully aware of what the actual legal ramifications of what the municipality deals with on a daily basis. Because we saw the letter as a combination of lack of information and a little belligerence.
Lack of judgment.
We felt that the appropriate approach was to give them the information so that they cannot sit in a position where they say, well, we didn't know that was the truth. And we hope that that conversation that we started, which was, 2 hours long and fully covered soup to nuts how the municipality is bound and how we enforce our codes, will allow them to continue the conversation in a constructive way. And I think that Assemblymember Zalatel and Mr. Rivera and the Midtown Community Council actions are greatly appreciated because they did start a fire with the letter and walk away from it. And we're spending a lot of time walking around trying to clean up that mess. And I think it's entirely appropriate that this body respond however they feel fit.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance, then Mr. Weddleton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, a question to Ms. Browse. One thing the letter definitely seemed to show is a dearth of information. If the state legislators, don't know or aren't familiar with the process and don't know what the Muni's been doing, it goes back to the point about communicating, to the public what's been done. And I know that's very challenging. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think could be done to further help the public understand, the efforts, what's been going on, and to educate about costs, to educate about the different facets of it? Do you have thoughts after being involved in this area for quite a few years?
Good Chair to Mr. France, I would say that while there is a lack of information for the legislators themselves who signed the letter, a fair amount of them are fully aware of the legal parameters that we work under and the process that we use.
Sure.
And they signed the letter specifically because their constituents wanted them to. We've also been told that that letter was not the approved version that was supposed to be sent. So I think that there's a lot of miscommunication going around this issue. What we're trying to do is control that as much as possible by putting out factual information. If people who have attended the homelessness committee meeting over the last few years are fully aware that a lot of times people know what the accurate information is, but they don't like it. And that will give you an opportunity to spin up whatever faction of the community that you want to have focus on this issue that you don't like. And that was, I think, the genesis of this letter, is something that the legislators don't like, and not actual truth. So getting the information to them and to the public is something that we can all work more on. I think the work of the homelessness committee, and as we go into the budget cycle, we'd like to have sort of longer conversations about the resolution with the budget and how we can refocus specific funding opportunities for these issues, particularly in light of the governor's vetoes, which came down today, which are going to be devastating to our process and the way we deal with homelessness in Anchorage and throughout the state of Alaska. So I think that this is the beginning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Before I get to you, Mr. Weddleton, I have a lot of folks in the queue, and we have a couple other things that we want to talk about. I guess one question I want to have for the members is, do we want to respond? And how do we want to respond? If the first answer is yes. I did make that invitation to have that meeting, and I think we should move forward with that. But if we want to have a response before that meeting, I would love to get input from the members on that. So I'll start with you, Mr. Weddleton, here in the Q&A.
I'm just going to bend more, but I'll pass on the interest of time. But we could maybe send a letter to each of the Anchorage House and Senate members who did not sign that letter, thank them for that and their wisdom, and also make sure they know what is truly going on. I personally do that.
That's a good idea.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And when I initially read the letter, my first thought was, I've been in special session in Juneau, and if you're not on the conference committee or on the finance committee, you have got a ton of time on your hands. And my initial thought was somebody had too much time on their hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Dunbar, did you want to weigh in on this?
No, fine, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Ms. Saltel, did you want to weigh in?
I think there should be some response, and that it should be coordinated and public so that we honestly aren't left scrambling individually. The scrambling I had to do in response to Midtown Community Council to get accurate information to them was quite cumbersome and time intensive. I'm lucky I have a flexible job. So I want to keep that idea that we have limited resources in our bandwidth as well.
Thank you, Ms. Saltel. Mr. Konski.
I was in the queue, and what I would have said then is I just would say back to all of the administration, your presentation was exceptional, and the materials that were contained therein really did clearly establish a truthful statement of what we're doing, and I think that it would be wise for somebody to convert that into some kind of a video primer on how our homeless service response works, so that any member of the public can download something that's visually compelling, but at the same time information rich about how we're responding. And in so doing, I think we could take, and that slide deck is the outline, it's perfect for that kind of a communication tool. And
Put a link on the Muni channel so they can watch it.
yeah, no, like really, so we could all share it, and this is what's really going on, and this will help. And then I do also support the idea of coming back together, and John's perfect touch is to say thank you to everyone who exercised wisdom and good judgment, and in it then say we would like to share with you all in a public setting what we're doing. That's very smart.
Thank you, Mr. Konski. Ms. Quinn-Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As much as we all individually want to say something snarky, I actually think that that's a bad idea, and I think it elevates this argument between us and the legislators, and I think that we need to, as a community, be really mature and say, here are all the things we're doing. Like, oh, you must not have understood that. Here's all, which it sounds like we're doing. And we could certainly send a letter to all legislators and say, you know, here, we want to communicate everything we're up to. Here's what we're up to. And I think that's worthwhile. But I just want to really caution us from getting involved in a back and forth that's a public back and forth that then makes us all look bad. And I had written down, it's funny you brought that up, fact sheet. I actually talked to Nancy Burke a couple of weeks right before that letter came out and said, we need a fact sheet. We need something to give to people. Like, and I agree with you, Ona, that the people at the Homelessness Committee know what we're doing and they're sometimes misrepresenting that. The people in our communities don't. And I think that's the problem is that, you know, when we go to community councils, sometimes people are intentionally hostile, but sometimes they just don't know. And what they're hearing is Stephanie Rhodes' letter or the legislators' comments, because those are being widely publicized. So I want to find a way to say, oh no, so-and-so, here's actually what we're doing. Here's a sheet, or here's a link to our muni website where it says, here's the video of what we're doing. And so yeah, I just think we all together need to find a way to communicate better to the average person.
Through the chair, Ms. Quinn Davidson, I would agree with you. And I think that one of the things that came out of this meeting, as Mr. Constant has sort of implied, is that this is a comprehensive update that we are talking about turning into some version of roadshow or town hall or opportunities for people to come and listen to the information. I would also agree that keeping communication strong between the administration and the assembly on this issue is very important. One of the reasons that this has occurred is a lack of communication through multiple bodies. And what we don't want to see happen is to have that continue further. I'm not suggesting that the assembly has to check with us before they take action on anything. I'm just saying that the conversation is important to keep everybody on the same page, because the letter was addressed to the mayor and the chief of police and given to the assembly as notice that this letter was going out. I completely understand the feeling that this is the work that this body has been doing for years, and it is taken as a personal slight that these things are being said about this process. And what we don't want to see happen is have that personal feeling come through in the conversation, particularly when it is about such a vulnerable population. We don't want to make this process between our governing bodies inflame the public rhetoric around this issue.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Ms. LaFrance, do you want to weigh in?
Just briefly, I support the idea of a letter, maybe by the co-chairs of the committee, or the three of you who attended and agree with Ms. Quinn Davidson that it's not a back and forth, but more emphasizing what has been done, what's going on. And I just wanted to note too that you mentioned a fact sheet, Austin. I was trying to work on a frequently asked questions sheet, because over the past 2 years, certain questions, they're cyclical, but from questions about public inebriation or questions about, what's the court ruling, because I know I have learned a lot in these last 2 years and framed the problems very differently than I did 2 years ago. And so I know there is a need for members of the public to, have their questions answered and to have access to this information too. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. All right, so just to wrap this conversation up, did you want to respond, Ms.
I was just going to say, my apologies for not addressing that earlier in Ms. Quinn Davidson's comment. We do have that coming. We're working on that right now with the Rasmussen organization and our internal teams to make sure that the commentary can address the situation in a very consumable format for the public, so that it's not specific about, the Engel case makes X, Y, and Z sort of claims that we have to do this, but says what our bounds are and what our operation process is. So that's coming.
Can I ask a quick question to what Ona said?
Okay, very quickly.
It's not just about the legal stuff, though,
Oh,
right? It's like
100%.
people say there's more homeless people than there used to be. Myth, real answer.
Yes.
No, there's more people in camps. Myth,
Yes.
really. Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Or just real quick, sorry, Mr. Chair, or even, the question we get about why can't we have, an official camping place? I mean, everything that people ask, because many of them, as harsh as some of the comments sound, oftentimes they're coming from a very well-intentioned place. And I think that we owe answers to people. on that.
And through the chair to Mr. Prince, we fully agree, and I think Mr. Gates and other members of the body have received what we think are attempts at well-reasoned commentary on, well, why can't we do this, or can we make this illegal, or can we make this illegal? And the information is usually, that's already illegal, that's already part of our process, we already do those things. And so making sure that it's comprehensive and doesn't just include the legal portions, but includes the questions that we get. We've been asked to give to our municipal employees because they regularly get questions of the health department and the permitting department and other departments so that they have appropriate answers and are enabled to sort of continue the conversation in an accurate way. So yes, that's coming. And we'll disseminate that so that you can take a look at it. If there's any specific question that you would like included, please forward it to me.
All right, so next time I'm going to set aside an hour just to talk about this.
Communication.
Yeah,
It's a whole
so it is a whole thing in and of itself. So I do want to say that we do have a meeting scheduled, well, not scheduled yet, but it is being scheduled sometime soon between Mr. Perez-Verdia, I think Ms. Alatel, and Ms. Burke to talk about some of the experiences folks have had. So your Omaha trip, Mr. Weddleton, your San Francisco trip, Mr. Constant. And I feel like there's a third, the Houston trip that Mr. Perez-Verdia took. And in part of that meeting, I can just extend that meeting so we can continue this conversation since it's going to be germane to the topic. But I do have to move us on because...
So that'll be a all of us meeting.
And all of us
Great.
meeting.
Okay.
I think we would be wise to take one more bucket conversation, either with or without Lori, on the communications piece, just so we have a free-flowing, robust conversation on that
Sure.
topic,
I'm into that,
separate
yeah.
from any topical areas.
Yeah, we could do that. But now, getting on to our two agenda items on the agenda in our last 14 minutes. So I'm just going to start with Mr. Weddleton. And this is sort of the idea that we have developed for the Rules Committee is talk about anything that you guys have coming up that's in the hopper, anything you're working on right now that maybe isn't introduced yet that you want to talk about, or any ideas that you might have so that other members can say, oh, I'm interested in that idea. I was also thinking about that. Let's work together on that. So that's something that we've talked about as a body a few times. So I'm going to start with you, Mr. Weddleton, to see if you have anything.
This is a great idea, and I did email this to Lori, and I would have a totally incomplete long list. But it was interesting to me when we did those responses, most people had these big, broad, visionary things, and I had little detailed things. But so I know just broadly what I've been working on in general is redoing the scoring system for our federal highway funds, which I've probably mentioned before, and to focus it more on community goals and not faster, wider, straighter roads. Okay, so it'd be a challenge, but the world is turning that way. It is actually, I think, will happen. We're not alone in that. There are some hillside things that are ongoing, and that's expand the Parks Rec service area, which I tried my first or second year and it failed. But at some point, that has to happen because the problems continue to get worse up there. People looking for access, but those are a couple big ones. There's more. I'll save those for the next.
All right, fair enough.
Okay, we, Dean and Suzanne and I are working on our list of trails where trapping will not be, where the new trapping regulations will be in effect. And we're thinking that's probably going to come out sometime in August.
Thank you. Mr. DeBarr.
So I've mostly been working on a variety of East Anchorage projects that some of them will have to come to this body, though. I think there's a particular right-of-way that I'm working with Mr. Schutte on, and some other things, mostly dealing with trail connectivity within East Anchorage, trying to make it so that you can start at Westchester and end at Johnstown without leaving some version of a trail. In terms of bigger things coming forward, I spoke on the record during our marijuana debate that I think the best way forward for on-site consumption is to do a plebiscite. That is to put it on the ballot in 2020. And so I've asked Mr. Gates to start looking into what that ballot question would look like. But I'm not in a huge rush to do it. We just had a fight over this issue and consumed quite a lot of oxygen. It doesn't have to get finalized until January. I think we should have it sooner than that. But I think, late summer, early fall is probably when I would want to revisit the on-site consumption discussion.
Thank you. Ms. Solotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm working on a two-pronged fire ordinance or a pair of fire ordinances. One would allow the chief or her designee to designate wildfire danger areas along our strips where fire conditions pose a significant threat, and those would be then subject to a 72-hour abatement of camps. The other is with regard to fire fuel implements. It would allow for confiscation of those, I should say, storage is personal property, and there's some logistical issues with that. Those should be ready and will be introduced into the addendum on 7/9. The idea is we want to have something available as a tool for fire danger going into the windy and dry season of August and beyond. And the other, which we mentioned at the Committee on Homelessness meeting, is shelter licensing standards, as well as redoing the overflow shelter ordinances. And both of those ordinances will be probably before the committee next month for further more in-depth discussion.
Can we respond now to some of that stuff, or like what's the?
Yeah, if we have things like, I know Suzanne and I were working on something very similar to what Ms. Solotel was working on, right?
Well, I just wanted to note that didn't we get quite far down the road on a similar confiscation of propane bottles and their fire?
Yeah, that was
Yep.
Frost and I
So
sometime ago.
this one differs in that we treat, and this is on the advice of counsel, these as personal property. We're not treating them as evidence or implements of a crime or presuming they're stolen. They will be personal property like all the other implements of a camp. And so if deemed, they'll be available for retrieval during the normal time. There, of course, there's some safety logistics there to work out in the practical implementation. So I think that's a key difference from past efforts and current efforts. It was very clear that APD is not interested in storing them as evidence or even seizing them related to any criminal activity because they don't have the probable cause necessary or the proof.
Was that the approach we took last time, that they were evidence? I thought we were just...
It was, I believe, the approach that we took last time, and then Ms. LaFrance and I, the approach that we took in what we were drafting. I don't think it was similar to Crofts. I think it took a different tact than Crofts had. But it was under public nuisance, and it was sort of reckless use of these different fire apparatus. And if reckless use was shown, then we could take it away. And I don't know how Ms. Solotel's differs.
So then we'd have to come up with a definition of reckless use.
And this one doesn't include something like that. It is, I'm glad I remember. If they are in, this still has reckless manner, which is a disregard for an imminent fire hazard. And so the idea is coupled with the wildfire designation area, they would come out as a imminent fire hazard, and summary abatement may occur by immediately impounding them. But the impounding of them will be treating them as personal property, not as any kind of evidence of any other type. So they will be available for reclamation through the normal procedures we do use. And I think that's kind of really the key difference in between them, is that we're treating them as personal property.
I presume we'll have work sessions on these coming up pretty soon.
I'm hoping so.
Yep. Good. So, my turn?
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a bit of a list. Like John, I have a slate of projects. I didn't send them because she said, don't send me your detailed list. She said, send me your big ideas. So, sometimes I listen. Tax abatement policies, I'm looking at, in particular one that is like a home, what's the word, my brain's tired right now, I guess. When you have like 4-star, 5-star, 6-star construction, you get a tax abatement. But we can't do a number of tax abatements without state authorization. And so this is going to be a conversation with the CEDC, probably ultimately the legislative committee, for an ask of a certain set of tax abatement policies from the legislature. So that's more long range. There's a responsible contracting ordinance in development between myself and Ms. Quinn Davidson right now. that will provide for some better review and kind of qualifications of contractors doing business with the muni. I have one project that I've been working on for 2 years and I'm getting no traction on yet still, and that's undergrounding equity. Our undergrounding of our utilities tends to be in areas that are outside of the downtown because it's much cheaper, better deal for the utilities to do. And there's the secondary utilities that are also not participating, and so in the downtown we're being left with half poles and wires in the places we've already undergrounded. And so that's an area I'm wanting to work on. I have an election eligibility conversation happening right now with legal. The intent is to set up an ordinance in the code that restricts an executive appointee of the state at the commissioner or deputy commissioner level serving on the school board or the assembly. And it's a conversation I'll be bringing forward probably before January. Then there's a conversation I'm having with Mr. Schutte on the building safety service area and how to merge all of the municipality into a standardized system of building safety. And then one that's on the agenda, we're having a work session today, is burning wire. And then finally, this one's kind of a big one, and I'm working on this one with Mr. Rivera and Ms. Quinn Davidson. It's conversion therapy ban for minors, and that's a conversation that will be kicking up in August and probably running through the fall before the body.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Great. Yeah, so conversion therapy ban, responsible contracting with Chris. And you all know that Dee and others and I are working on assembly procedures, bringing back what Eric originally brought forward. Suzanne and I have been following through with Mr. Weddleton on Mr. Cheney's vision for Tobacco 21, and that should be introduced soon. We were hoping for today, but I don't know if we'll get there. We're going to introduce today code changes to the vacancy provisions in Title II when an assembly member, when the position becomes vacant, sort of how we proceed, just cleaning up some language there. Forrest and I have been talking about working on parking rules for veterans, Purple Heart veterans.
Oh, yeah.
And so we just haven't, we're actually, the administration is waiting on us in that instance. So just to give you guys some credit there. Suzanne and I also probably will be working through our health policy committee to propose some code changes related to substance misuse. Many of you are on the committee or attend the committee meetings, but we've been having the last couple months, along with Tobacco 21, we've had some presentations from Alaska Fellow who did a great job of highlighting all the different types of substance misuse issues and then narrowing it down to what the assembly can do to make a difference. And we're going to circle back in a month or two and talk through that. And there's a couple other health policy things coming too. And Chris Schutte and I have talked a little bit about workforce housing and what we could do there, and I'm still interested in exploring some land use stuff with him. So.
Thank you. Mrs. Franks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to follow up on the wildfire or fuel tank, we're calling it ordinance, that actually Mr. Croft, when he was on the body, as Mr. Dunbar noted, started and was co-sponsored by the chair, Mr. Rivera, and then I had joined on that. And this is kind of a little bit, I guess, frustrating because in my mind, this was not an abatement issue, but more like, Ms. Zelato characterized, but yet it seems like it always ends up becoming an abatement issue. And I know that, AFD does not view the storage of tanks on muni property as a fire hazard, and APD believes they have all the tools they need in order to intervene in any potential public safety situation. So I look forward to reading your proposed draft because this one seems like it continues to meet roadblocks. The chair and I are working on an ordinance with the administration that would address some gaps in code for pawn shops that would enable the single staffed position, pawn shop clerk, to leverage her time to do more in terms of recovering stolen property. Am I out of time?
Oh, you're good.
Oh. And as Ms. Quinn Davidson said, we've got a few things coming through the Health Policy Committee, including an ordinance on vaccinations pertaining to child care, daycare establishments, and that's being led by the administration, Ms. Pineda. And also we'll be looking at animal code. That's coming up in
August,
in
I think.
August?
Yeah, we just sat down and put our agenda out for the next few months.
And then just wanted to note too, on the public safety agenda, we'll, I think for July, we'll be discussing, I'll probably have to call into that one, but discussing the resolution for peace officer partial pensions, whereas Mr. Constant and I have a different view on how that one should go as far as timing. I know you're thinking, Mr. Constant, sooner. I would prefer later. So I'm hoping to be able to dial into that, but can send more information as to what my view is. And then finally, at the last joint meeting with ASD, we talked about the Safe Routes Committee. And someone who's in PTA sent me a notice that apparently ASD Transportation has implemented the Hazardous Routes Committee starting this July, and it looks like there are a bunch of ASD people on it, including MOA traffic, but I don't think anyone on the body received any notice of that. This was sort of an incidental notice, so just pointing that out.
Mr. Chair, I would just add back to the idea of the difference of our opinions. My opinion isn't that it should be sooner or later, but it should be every year until it's done. And let's not waste a year. So that's, to me, later in the year is fine, but every single year until we get there.
May I follow up?
Sure, brief.
And my position is that we should look strategically at it, and we have an opportunity to collaborate with the administration and the Alaska Municipal League to have our most effective push forward.
All right. So for the purposes of time, I'm just going to talk about three things that I have in the hopper, and then we will move on. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to the committee discussion, which I was actually really looking forward to today, talking with the committees. But I'll reach out to the committees one-on-one. Ms. Zolotel knows this, and so does Mr. Perez-Verdia. I invited them. They actually reached out to me initially, and then I reached out to them to just do a check-in on their committee, see how things are going on, and if they wanted any guidance or help from me on their committee. And so I'm going to do the same with all of the other committees. They have found it helpful to ping-pong things off of me. So I will do the same for everyone else, but it'll probably just be via email. We don't have time today. So I'm just going to talk about three things. First, fire apparatus. I know that we've talked about it. Ms. Altel has, Ms. LaFrance has, but I just want to echo what Ms. LaFrance said, which was it was clear to us when we met with them, both APD, AFD, that they had the tools to do what they needed to do. So I look forward to Ms. Alatel's version, and specifically when it comes to fire hazards and what that looks like, what the weather looks like for that, who determines all that, and how that distinction might be different from ours. Ms. LaFrance and I are working on an ordinance dealing with executive appointees and the need to have those appointees, specific appointees, with the opportunity to bring any of the 142, I believe, appointees before us, but having a hearing, confirmation hearing for certain appointees and then all others as desired. And then lastly, we're going to see it later today, but the tax relief for fire for all properties, real properties, we're going to have a work session on that later today. So those are three things I want to let everyone know about. So I'm going to go ahead and adjourn this, and then we'll get ready to go.
Public comment.
We are out of time, sir. So I'm going to go ahead and adjourn.